let me know if they can be. Okay. That's behaving the way I wanted it to. So, hello everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here and able to speak to you. I'm a mover, so because I'm wireless, you might find me anywhere in the room throughout this talk. But the slides are what you really need to be looking at. I'm going to look like this the whole time. So, what I'm going to be talking to you about today is the honeybee dance language and collective decision making, collective intelligence in bees. And we decided on this topic not because I've published any magnificent research manuscripts on the subject. In fact, I haven't done all that much work on this particular topic. But it's because bee meetings have a tendency to get a little bit dreary. Often you go to one of these club meetings or association meetings, and what you hear is Varroa, small hive beetles, American foul brood, everything's terrible. Thank you for coming, go home. So, as an expert in Varroa bee interactions, I am going to be talking about that later on, but I felt like it wouldn't be a good way to start the day for us to just dive right into Varroa. So instead, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be focusing on this phenomenon, the honeybee dance language that took human beings thousands of years for us to decode. And I want to do this because how many of you are new beekeepers? You've been beekeeping for, let's say, 2 years or less. There's a fair number of them. How many of you have been beekeeping for longer than I've been alive? Probably a handful of them. So there's a pretty wide range in this room, but I'm hoping that everybody is going to learn some new material here, because there's so much to talk about, and it doesn't come up because this isn't a deep applied beekeeping talk, but it's going to make you a better beekeeper to understand the biology that underlies these organisms. So, as humans, we often pay a fair amount of money for somebody to teach our children how to dance. There's dance classes all over the place. You might have to go to a dance recital, some weekend this spring. But what I find more interesting as an evolutionary biologist and animal behaviorist is not how dancing happens, but why dancing happens. So, within human beings, we can look at a number of different examples of dancing, but all of them are sort of hard to explain at first glance. This is a weird behavior for an organism to engage in. So why is it happening? Well, in humans, we can try to come up with explanations, answers to these questions. What's the function of dancing? What does it achieve? What is its purpose? Why is it happening? So in humans, you might dance for a performance aspect. You might dance for an athletic experience. This is the Ajumu dance that is done by the Maasai in Kenya. Young men will compete to see who can sort of jump higher in rhythm, and then the girls will go and sing to whichever one jumped highest, because he's the most attractive guy in the building. So this is a different form of dancing, but it's still dancing. These are whirling dervishes, who are Sufi mystics out of an Islamic sect, and they spin in order to have these religious experiences. This is a contra dance that you might find all over the country, folks doing square dancing or contra dancing. This is a social experience. That's why these people are dancing. And you can even have something like competitive ballroom dancing. So there's a wide range. We're often told as humans that we should dance like nobody's watching, right? If you've ever driven behind the car of a dancer, you've probably seen a bumper sticker to that effect. But the reality is, very few people who dance are dancing without an audience. Dancing tends to be something that you do to someone. And when you dance to someone, it opens up a really interesting door. When you dance to an audience, it means that we can start looking at dance for communication purposes. So we can look at something like an interpretive dance performance. Not all of us might have the same thing communicated to us by watching this, but maybe we'll all feel something. We can look at something like a ballet where the dance and its story are a little bit more clear to us, and so we can follow it along, especially if we've got a playbook that we can flip through. And if you look at something like hula, there is even a vocabulary of dance in some of these traditions, where you're dancing so that you're able to communicate something to the watchers. Humans are dancers. We dance quite a lot in a lot of different ways, but we didn't invent it. There are other organisms that are absolutely doing something that looks to all the world like us like dancing. Now, this is one of our cousins, so maybe it's cheating to just look at another ape, but we can look at organisms that aren't at all related to us. This is Snowball, this very famous cockatoo, who really, I think he really likes Britney Spears and the Backstreet Boys. That's his jam, but he'll dance to a lot of things. He's doing that probably to show off to girls. That's why this behavior exists. And even if it's not a bird caged up in somebody's apartment, you can find other male birds eagerly dancing to try to attract a mate. So much like humans, a lot of dancing is all about trying to get a partner. But you don't have to limit ourselves to vertebrates, because we can look at invertebrates, arthropods, things like this peacock jumping spider, who is also doing this display so that he can get himself a girlfriend. He's going to try to dazzle and wow and attract a female peacock jumping spider this way. So all of these are examples of another case where we can look at this dance behavior and we can ask, why is this happening? And that's what brings us to honeybees. So I'm going to start with a story. And the story is this. Once upon a time, before I was able to have bees at my house, I went out into my yard and I hung up a bird feeder. I studied bees, my wife studied birds. So I wanted to get hummingbirds coming so that she could watch them. And so I put up this hummingbird feeder, and I looked out, and the next day, no hummingbirds. I looked out the next day, no hummingbirds. I looked out the next day, no hummingbirds. I looked out the next day, covered in bees. And what was interesting was each of those 3 preceding days, there had been 0 bees, and suddenly it was absolutely mobbed. Why was that happening? What was going on here? Well, what was happening there was honeybees have a very, very difficult problem they have to solve. And it's something that we often forget about when we're working with our bees. Bees go out and bees make honey. That's what they do. But we have to remember the landscape that our bees are experiencing while they try to make honey. So what happened here was that these bees had gone out, they had been looking for food. One bee had discovered my hummingbird feeder, and then had found a way to get the rest of the colony out to that feeder to quickly get as much sugar as possible. So we like to think of the world as being full of flowers, right? We're in winter now, but of course in summer and spring, this is what the world will look like. But that's not really the case, is it? There are a lot of places in the world, even in the middle of summer, where the world isn't completely covered in high-value flower blooms. So what our honeybees are trying to do is solve this problem. They need to find nectar in a very patchy landscape of nectar. There's a lot of places that have nothing, there's a lot of places that they need to get to, and they need to get there quickly because they're competing with other honeybees, with any of a number of other organisms. And it's more challenging than this because they're also competing with time. They need to get that nectar while it's available because that nectar might not remain available forever. And so we can imagine in this story, maybe we've got these purple flowers that are going to bloom for a week, and then they'll all die off for the rest of the year. Then maybe a week later, these yellow flowers will bloom. Then maybe it'll be 2 months before the next flowers, these pink ones, will bloom in the landscape. This is a really, really hard problem that bees have got to solve. And so if we look at a graph of some nectar flows that have been published, we'll see very clearly that this is not a world of fly out, make honey until winter comes. This is a world of fly out, see if there's any nectar available, get as much of it as you possibly can in a very, very tight time period, and then wait, ripen that nectar down into honey, and wait. Keep looking for the next chance to rush out in force and get as much sugar as you can. This is a fun little exercise. So if we look at a honeybee and we measure how long she is, and we figure out what her foraging range is, and then we look at a human and we say, all right, the average human is about 5'4", 5.4 feet, sorry. And we do a little bit of math. We know that the maximum foraging range that we would expect to see for most honeybee colonies is about 10 kilometers. Now, most of that foraging is happening within 1 or 2 kilometers, but we know that bees will fly 10 kilometers for food if they need to. So if we do a little bit of math and we scale that up, what we discover is that the human foraging range, if we were people bees, would be about 1,100 kilometers. So that would mean that a human who flew out of her hive in Detroit would be flying between Omaha, Nebraska, and Boston, Atlanta, and the southern tip of James Bay in Canada. So that is what our honeybees are experiencing of their landscape. That is the landscape that they are searching to try to make honey. How do other bees do this? So this is just one example of a native bumblebee species. And this bumblebee is not going to be able to do things nearly as efficiently as our honeybees are. So there are bumblebees that live in nests. This is a Bombus impatiens colony here. And they're produced by a company called BioBest. And if you look down in there, you can see that we've got, there's a queen roaming around. They've built little wax pots. They've got workers who are going out and collecting food and taking care of the brood. It's something that would be relatively familiar to us as honeybee keepers. How do bumblebees solve this problem? Well, not very well. They essentially go out and with no recruitment at all, just individually search for flowers. Maybe they'll come home and they'll have some flower nectar and some flower pollen on them, and they might run around to try to advertise that there is food available somewhere, but they're not able to take their sisters and bring them out to collect any of that food. Honeybees are unique in that, and Aristotle recognized this. Aristotle wrote a book called the Historia Animalium well, he probably didn't call it that, but that's what we call it, in 330 BCE. And in that, he listed everything that was known about honeybees. And there were two facts that he listed that are of interest to us now. Bees recruit each other to specific food sources, and honeybees engage in some dancing-like movements, which he found remarkable, and so he commented on it. But Aristotle didn't connect those two facts. He just said, somehow bees are able to all find this hummingbird feeder, or whatever the Greek equivalent was, and also these bees, if you look closely at them, will sometimes engage in these generations. But he didn't put those facts together, and it took us an embarrassingly long time to put those two facts together. So I want to talk to you about that story. This is what that dancing looks like, by the way. If we look here, we can see this bee in the middle, who is running and then repeating herself, running off more or less in the same direction. So she's going from right to left, waggling her body, and then turning and running in essentially a figure eight. And you can see that this is not a bee on her own. This is a bee who is dancing to an audience. She is surrounded by other bees who are paying very close attention to her, almost getting in her way. So that video and a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking to you about is work that was done in part by my doctoral advisor, Tom Seeley. So I'd just like to thank him for the permission to use these videos to talk about some of his work, and also for all the mentorship that he provided to me as his final minted PhD. Really, though, Tom and I both owe a lot of our work to this man, Dr. Karl von Frisch, who was an Austrian bee scientist, and he, if you look at this note down here, so Tom was my PhD advisor. Karl von Frisch was Tom's PhD advisor's PhD advisor's PhD advisor. So that makes Dr. von Frisch my academic great-great-grandfather. So what von Frisch did was he was fascinated by honeybee recruitment, and he wanted to examine them. So he trained honeybees to go to feeders full of sugar water, scented sugar water, and he thought that the bees were using the scent of the flowers in order to communicate. They were coming back with this little sample, and then the other bees were using those odors in order to find the food. So he noticed, though, during that research, which didn't really pan out, that these bees were engaging in these dances. And that had been known for a very long time. But he started really looking at the dances very closely. And he realized that they were incredibly precise. They varied in tempo, they varied in duration, they varied in the direction that the bees were doing it. But the individual bees were being very, very consistent about these dances. So he started to look more closely at it. What Karl von Frisch was able to demonstrate is as follows. First of all, honeybees, somehow, are able to communicate to one another the direction that they need to fly to get food. And the way he did this was pretty simple. So you can see down here, we've got this little array of feeders, and then this feeder down below it that's labeled F. So F was a feeder of sugar water that all the bees in the hive were trained to fly out to. And when they were consistently going out to that feeder, they took it away, and then they filled up all of the other feeders at these different locations. And what we discovered is that these numbers tell us how many foragers arrived at those feeders. And you can see very clearly that the vast majority of them, in this experiment 24, are showing up at the feeder in the correct direction. So there's something about direction that's being communicated to naive bees who never saw that original feeder full of sugar water. He also demonstrated that the bees were able to communicate the distance to the food. And they did that using an experiment like this. Again, we've set out a series of feeders. Just one of them, this feeding station 750 meters away from the hive, has been set up to recruit a whole bunch of foragers who are then going to go back and start communicating about it. Then all of the other feeders are filled, and we'll look at how many bees show up at them. And again, we can see that the majority of the bees are showing up at the feeders that were 700 meters or 800 meters away. It wasn't exact, but a lot of those bees were getting some signal inside the hive that said, hey, I know you've never gone out and foraged today, or in this setup before, but I think you should fly about 750 meters away, and that's where you'll find food. He also noticed that while these bees were dancing, they would occasionally stop, and they would interact with one another. They would exchange nectar, they put their tongues together. So there was an opportunity for taste, for smell of those flower sources, those food sources, to also be communicated. So he then described 2 dances of the bees, and he gave to them meanings, which have been borne out by subsequent research. The first is the round dance, where the bees, if the food source is within about 50 meters from the hive, the bees will engage in this predictable sort of round-shaped dance. It's a figure 8 that essentially keeps them going in a circle. And what that communicates is there is food, it is close, you should go get it, and it smells and tastes a little something like this. You get a free sample doled out to you. So this was what he observed, and it was the dance that they observed for a very long time, because where they were doing this research, and it was very convenient to just set up the feeders very close by. At one point they had to move the lab, and they wound up moving it to a spot where the distance where they would normally have walked out and just set up those feeders was actually in the middle of a pond. So instead they would go all the way around the pond and start setting out the feeders. And when they moved the food more than 50 meters away from the observation hives, what they discovered was that a very different dance started to happen. That's the waggle dance. The waggle dance is for longer distance communication, and in it, a bee is going to engage in that waggle run that we saw the video of earlier. Her abdomen and her wings are going to be moving as she runs in some direction, and then she'll do a figure 8 to return to where she started, and then do another waggle run in the same direction. And the angle with respect to straight up and down, with respect to vertical, was always consistent when you were watching a bee doing her waggle dancing. And that is because bees are communicating how to find food based on the location of the food relative to the sun. So this is how that works. When I'm a bee and I'm doing a waggle dance, I know where my hive is, I know where this great profitable source of flower nectar is, and as I was flying home, I know where the sun was. Was it over my right shoulder or my left shoulder? Was it straight ahead or was it behind me? And so honeybees have developed this language, this dance language, in which a bee who is dancing that waggle run straight upwards is saying, go outside, figure out where the sun is, and fly towards it. If she's dancing 20 degrees to the right of the sun, what she's saying is go outside, turn 20 degrees, or if she's dancing 20 degrees to the right of straight up and down, what she's saying is go outside, find the sun, turn 20 degrees to the right, and go that way. So that's the way that these bees are able to point other bees from within the confines of the hive. And that's not all. So more research that Dr. Budfresh and his students did showed us that the number of waggles per run, or the duration of each of those waggle runs, communicates the distance. That's how they're doing it. It's approximate, but you can think of it something like 1 second of waggling is fly 1 kilometer, 2 seconds of waggling is fly 2 kilometers. They also showed that the duration of the dancing shows quality. So you will dance longer if it's a really, really good food source. If it's a high sugar concentration, if it's really profitable, you might spend an hour dancing. If it's mediocre, you might do 1 or 2 dances and then sort of give up. And the other bees that are in the area around those bees, they are the audience. They are watching that waggle dance take place, and if you mark those bees that you can see gathered around the dancer, you will then find them flying out and then flying off in the direction that dancer just told them to go. So this is just one graph that shows that distance correlation. The duration of that waggle run, 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and the distance to the food source. You can see it's not exactly a straight line, but there is clearly a correlation. There's a relationship here. That distance is being communicated by how long they're running. So the better the food source is, the longer that dancer is going to keep dancing to advertise it. That's earth-shattering. That's huge. That's a tremendous fact. Because what that means is that if you are a bee standing inside your hive saying, I don't know where I should go looking for food today, you are much more likely to find a bee who is dancing about a really high-quality food source than one who's dancing about a low-quality source, because they'll dance a few times and stop. The great food sources are going to be advertised much more aggressively. And so when you walk through the bazaar of the dance floor and you find all of these bees dancing, you will probably be pointed towards a high-value food source. What that means is that honeybees aren't just making decisions about where to go get food, they're making good decisions. At a colony level, they are making excellent choices about how to allocate their foragers. So we can look at an example of that to sort of illustrate what I mean. So here's our field of flowers. Let's imagine that all of these different species of flower are blooming flowers. But let's imagine that the yellow flowers are pretty mediocre. They've got nectar at 2% sugar, just to throw a number at them. Maybe these purple flowers, those are 6% sugar, so they're more valuable, they're more interesting to the bees. The pink ones, let's say that those are our real winners, they're 9% sugar in their nectar. So obviously, if you were a honeybee colony, what would a good decision be? It would be go out and get everything you can from those pink flowers until they're empty. Then you would move on until you were back to the worst flowers, the yellow ones. So that's basically what we see. Now, it's important to understand that there are scout bees who are always out looking for new sources of food and dancing about it. So there's always this information being gathered, always this information being reported. So the colony, to the extent that it knows something, they know about all of these different flower patches. But most of the dancing will be about those pink ones. So what that means is that what you'll first see is that most of the extra foraging force in that colony are going to fly out until they've depleted those pink flower sources, that really high value source. Then we can imagine that if you look at those purple flower patches, well, one of them's a lot closer than the others. Bees can evaluate how far they had to fly with that food when they're doing the math of how valuable the food source was. So what we would then see probably is that the next batch of foragers would be allocated to the close high profit site. But then the next high value sites are going to get exploited until those are also depleted. And then the bees will go out and take advantage of whatever nectar is available to them until all of the flowers wilt. So this is the mechanism that allows these bees to make excellent choices and to really monopolize as much sugar as they possibly can from their landscape. That is what we need when we talk about collective intelligence in a honeybee colony. There's no one bee who's calling the shots. The queen isn't sitting in there saying, you this way, you that way. There's no dispatcher who's sending all of these bees out. It's just that because the bees get more excited and dance more about the best food sources, and because the recruits are sort of blindly wandering around waiting for someone to dance at them to tell them where to go, we wind up with a situation where the colony as a whole makes good choices. Other bees are not as impressive. So remember those bumblebees that just fly out and then maybe come home smelling like a flower? Well, if one bumblebee goes out and she encounters this nearby flower patch that's pretty mediocre, what she'll do is she'll then essentially tell all the other bumblebees, hey, there's something that smells like this nearby, and they might fly around looking for that odor. So they'll wind up missing this high-value resource that the honeybees are, meanwhile, exploiting aggressively. So, all right, we've been talking for a little bit, and this is the audience participation part. Can you waggle dance? I'm not going to make everybody stand up, but I want to make sure that we can think this through, that we understand how this works, because whether this is all new to you, or if you're teaching, students in local schools about beekeeping, this is something you should be able to explain. So, remember the way it works. The angle relative to straight up and down is the way that I communicate where that flower is. All right? So, if I'm a honeybee, and I fly out of my hive like this, and I fly towards a flower, I get some food, and the sun was sort of ahead of me as I was going there, and it's back behind me as I'm coming home, where am I going to dance? Where will my waggle run point? Straight up. Exactly. It's vertical, and it's directional, too. I'm pointing up. Because what would happen if I flew out, I visited this flower, and then I flew home, and I had the sun in my eyes as I was arriving back at the hive? It'd be straight up and down, but it would be pointing downwards. I'd be doing that figure 8, starting at the top and then buzzing my way down to communicate. How about this case? I'm flying out, there's the sun, there's my flower, I come home. I, as a bee, have accumulated this information as I'm arriving, and I'm going to start dancing. Where's my angle going to point? Right, so about 7 o'clock, 120 degrees to the right. 4 o'clock, right. So the bees that we are looking at are going to be able to do these predictable dances, and if we give them flower feeders, or sugar water feeders, they will do dances that correspond to them. And if we watch a bee doing a waggle dance, like this one, and then we go out to the spot that that waggle dance language is telling us to go, we will find flowers. So we can confirm the way that this works. So where is this bee pointing?
What?
She's pointing to the left, right? So what does that mean? Go outside. I'm a forager, I'm interpreting her. Go outside, what do I do next? Where's the sun? There it is. Turn left about 90 degrees, go that way. That's what she's saying. Now, you can see there's variation there. She's not perfectly pointing to the left. So it's not like this is a system that is completely and totally, mathematically precise, but it's absolutely a system that is driving the movement of honeybees in the landscape. So what Dr. von Frisch proposed was that bees were using their waggle dances, and with them they were communicating the direction, the distance, the quality, based on the duration, and the taste and smell of those dances. And what that means is that honeybees are engaging in symbolic communication. If you talk to a linguist, they will tell you that symbolic communication is the heart of what a language is. That means that honeybees are ranked in a group of organisms that's quite small. It includes us, it includes dolphins, it includes chimpanzees, it includes a very small number of organisms that are able to symbolically talk about something. In this case, they're using the rules of this dance to talk about the location of food outside of the hive. And all of this research that was done with sugar water feeders in the early 1900s has been confirmed using much more high-tech devices. So this is a study that took harmonic radar, these little antennae, and they glued them to the backs of foragers. And then they watched them doing waggle dances or observing waggle dances, and they figured out where they went. And what they did was they followed precisely the instructions that were given to them by the other bees' waggle dances. And so in this case, we can see that the hive and the feeder are up here at the top, and the bees are dancing towards that feeder, indicating that feeder, and then the new foragers with the radar on their backs are going off or the antennae on their backs are going to that feeder. If you grab one of those foragers just after she's watched her waggle dance, and as she thinks she's on her way out of her hive, you trap her in a tube and you sprint across the field, which is what they did here, and you release her at one of these other locations, and then you track where she goes. She goes exactly where the dance told her to. She flies, 150 meters to the right, and then looks around and says, hey, I was told there would be a feeder here. So this is very, very much what is happening with these bees. It is very much the driving force for honeybee navigation and recruitment. So we've talked about a bunch of the basics here, but you might very justifiably have some questions. You might be sitting there thinking, well, wait, what about this or what about that? Instead of going through all of that in the Q&A, I'm going to see if I can short-circuit that a little bit and answer some of the questions you might be thinking about. So one of them might be, how can bees see a dance inside a dark hive? How are they watching this dance take place? Well, wing vibrations produce a noise. When the bees are there moving and waggling, their wings are actually clattering together. And that noise is something that the other bees can hear. If you clip the wings of a bee while she's doing her waggle dance, she becomes uninterpretable. The other bees cannot figure out what she's talking about. You can even make a little robotic honeybee, and you can put that into your hive, have it dance across the surface of the comb, and give it little wings made out of razor blades. And if those razor blade wings are vibrating and banging against each other the same way a honeybee's wings are, you can have this robot do a waggle dance and point bees in a direction towards the feeder, and that's where they'll go. But if you take away those razor blade wings, and it just does little figure eights inside the colony, even if it vibrates itself, then the bees are not going to be able to interpret your robot. So it's not really a visual dance, it's a dance that they're hearing as they sit there and watch this bee sort of zoom past her in the hive. Another question you might ask is, how are bees able to measure distance, right? Well, Carl von Frisch suggested that maybe it was the calories that they burn. It's the amount of wing flaps that they have to do in order to get home or something. We actually know now that it's something called optic flow on the landscape. Bees look at sort of how complex the landscape in front of them is, and then they measure that optic flow. So if you're a bee flying across the desert, there's not a lot of optic flow. There aren't many landmarks in your landscape, so you have to get used to that. And then you kind of calibrate based on it. If you're a bee flying over a very, very complex landscape, then you're going to have more optic flow as you fly a certain number of meters. And so bees in a particular landscape can learn the optic flow patterns and use that to estimate distance. Another question you might ask is, well, how can they use the sun if the sun moves over the course of the day, right? That's something we've all seen the sun do. Well, bees actually adjust their dances over time in order to match the movement of the sun. So again, bees will learn the movement pattern of the sun in the particular season where they're doing this dancing. And they will actually slowly adjust their waggle dance angle over the course of a few minutes or maybe even an hour of waggle dancing. However, they also forage in between these bouts of dancing. It's not just that a bee finds a good food source and then sits there dancing all day. She goes back, she confirms that the thing she's dancing about is still there, is still high value. You don't want to go out, visit a flower, come back, dance all day, and then discover that you're sending all your sisters to a field that just got mowed soon after you came home.